It's rare to have a chance to debate a topic that's essentially kind of undebatable or unmentionable at times in polite European society. And it was only a few weeks ago that me and my colleagues were sitting down and thinking in some detail about this event, and we were asking ourselves, well, why is multiculturalism as a set of policies so resilient, even when over the years European leader after European leader has claimed that it fails? And this is not an easy question to answer, one I hope that some of our speakers can shed some light on.
In this session, we want to look at different experiences of multiculturalism and the diversity agenda across Europe. Commentators across the political spectrum have begun to lament that multiculturalism is a failed policy. It has failed as a response to immigration and as a means of managing diversity. But if that's the case, how do we explain its persistence? And perhaps more importantly, what does the future hold for multiculturalism and the politics of diversity?
We knew what was right for people when they lived in Africa and in the Middle East. But when people from Africa and the Middle East came to Sweden, we didn't want to tell them what was considered right in our country. That they had to discover for themselves. And it took ages before it was no longer racist to say that honor culture is a really bad idea. You can probably not blame multiculturalism for everything that has changed in Sweden over the past 50 years, but a less idealistic view of the world and Sweden's place in it. With such a less idealistic view, we could have defined terms like integration much clearer. We could have told people to learn Swedish and to get a job. We could have avoided regarding people from faraway countries as exotic victims. Actually, they traveled from problems, not to them. But the combination of fairly open borders, a generous welfare system, and no serious demands on newcomers to become part of society has been an invitation to trouble for all of us.
I would say that there is no real national integration strategy in the UK. And I think that this is a very serious problem in terms of diversity management. I think in order to cultivate a robust civic nationalism, to tie together a diversity of peoples, you need to be confident in your own national history and heritage. I think in Britain, you have politicians who remain very obsessed about the empire, British colonialism, and the atrocities associated with that. In my view, there's an overemphasis on the very negative aspects of British history and heritage. And in certain circles, there's an underemphasis on the good that Britain has done in the world. I think that more generally, when you look at the British experience, Britain overall in the post-World War II context has been incredibly open, especially when it comes to providing anti-discrimination protections on the grounds of race, ethnicity, and religion. So I think that the one thing that you need is that there has to be a greater level of confidence in your own national story. And I think that in the absence of that, or rather the absence of that cultivation and fostering of a civic nationalism, this is why multicultural thinking is still quite popular in some circles, because you don't have the alternatives there, or rather there's a lack of political will to cultivate a viable alternative to it. I think in Britain as well, there's a lack of clarity and understanding of what even means to be British. And I think until we have those political conversations and we're able to, over time, to organically establish a common moral cultural standard, then it does make integration more difficult. I'd also make the point there's mainstream elements of British culture which many socially conservative migrants will understandably not be willing to integrate themselves into.
You asked in your previous question something like, is worth to integrate people who is going to leave or in...
Yeah, I mean, has it persisted because it's a recognition of the fact of diversity, that things have just changed, people are not necessarily willing to integrate because of the nature of migration. Not saying that everybody doesn't want to integrate, it's because there are strong links to the past, and can we just assert that that's an issue against the facts?
So if you don't want to integrate, don't come. That's the main problem. We don't have to integrate them. It's mandatory for them to integrate in our nations. We put a welfare state, we put a state of law. We put some freedoms, basic freedoms, like freedom of speech, freedom of thought, the equality, even diversity and pluralism. And we put that in a nation. If they come, they have to integrate. In Spain, there have been 4 civil wars, 2 Republican periods. The first was bad, the second was terrible. 3 exiled kings, assassinations, a war against the United States, terrorist gangs, and in the last 45 years, almost 30 years of socialism. And despite all of the above, Spain remains Spain. Why? Because the Spanish people, throughout this time and even before, are an homogeneous people. Homogeneity, that ethos, is what has prevented Spain from disappearing a long time ago. Spanish politicians have hastily and with little resistance imported multiculturalism. They are convinced that this is a perfect tool to liquefy our identity and destroy the historical nation that always precedes and cements the political nation. And they are damned right. Multiculturalists do not believe in the concept of the nation, nor in the concept of democracy, understood as a consensus of the fundamental rules that must operate in a nation and its relationship with other states. This is what is happening in Spain. What 500 years has not achieved, this importation of minorities will achieve. Contributes to the fragmentation of society, its liquefaction, and therefore its paralysis and death.
Elites usually share this normative approach, and they feel that migration brings this advantage and that advantage to one's economy, society, and so on. The negative consequences of immigration in too big numbers are suffered by those who are living in the neighborhoods where migrants live, so to speak, in social and cultural silos. And since elites usually living far away from these neighborhoods, they have a different feeling of how the situation in the country is. And if in your political discourse you have the notion, not only the notion, but the practice of, the notion of populism, the practice of fighting populism, then of course you have to fight those ordinary stupid people who say, well, migration is really detrimental to our life world. Okay, they should adapt to the salvatory effect of migration. This would be the normal answer. And third reason, and not the most unimportant one, it is simply easier to let things go as they're moving. If you're trying to educate your child, always saying, well, don't do that, you should do that, well, this consumes energy. It's much more easier to have a laissez-faire approach. And this is why we do not change our immigration policy, our positive inclination towards multiculturalism, unless we see, and we cannot avoid to see, the negative consequences. This, in evolutionary theory, is called evolution into an impasse, at the end of which there is a regulatory catastrophe. And this is exactly what we are facing right now in Europe, and this is why I'm so optimistic. We will stop these wrong developments, because they simply lead us into serious problems in our societies.
A question to Rakib, which is, you mentioned the need to have a national conversation about who we are. What does that look like?
I think my point was we need to discuss how different minority groups interact with one another. So you're looking at success and integration within a particular group. I'm talking about how to integrate a diversity of communities in a particular locality. So there are two different things there. I think in terms of the discussion had about national conversation, these are conversations that I have in my local community in working class Luton. There's not many elites there, I can assure you. And I think that this is the kind of thing that families, communities across the country, I think they should be involved in that national conversation. But ultimately, if you want to make headway on integration policy, we do have a parliamentary democracy. So there has to be a degree of moral political leadership in order to see these changes that we'd like to see.
I'd like to bring up an aspect which is the inevitability of migration, whether or not it's something that you can do something about to stop or to limit, or is something that just happens and you have to all be happy about. This is the main tone of the debate in the European Parliament, where the majority here claims that migration is inevitable. It's good and it's inevitable, and we should all be happy about it. Is there a potential to fight back against this onslaught that we experience right now.
This vision of a borderless world, a borderless society is, at least in Sweden, and I think in many other countries as well, is very strong. And it's eroding at the moment because of all the violence that we see on a daily basis. But deep down inside, it's a decent worldview, and it's one that has a lot of positive elements. I would say when I was younger, I was definitely a supporter of a borderless world. And it's something that's gradually needed to be questioned and debated. And it's also very difficult to see the alternative. Should we close borders? Should we throw people out of the country who we don't feel belong there? And why don't they belong there? And how do we prepare for the nearest future? It's something that anybody who is poor and sees no future in his own country, it's perfectly both legal and reasonable to think that you want to change your circumstances. But how do we prepare for that? I don't think we have an answer, and the answer so far has been to be nice and polite and to accept that this might have a cost for our society, but for the moment we are prepared to pay it.
Could you give me a brief definition of what is an European or Western value?
What is a European value? There is not a single European value. My best possible answer for me, not possibly in the world, is the following one. European values are first inherited from the Greek, open-mindedness, love for discussions, critical thought. Second, from the Roman tradition, statecraft, how to organize and run effectively a state, even an empire. And third, from the Christian tradition, caring for others and not losing hope even in times of hardship. These three things account for very much of what we call European culture, and they have proven very fruitful throughout history.